In this session, we'll wrap up our reading of Genesis chapter 3 by looking at the last few verses, verses 20 to 24. Our liturgical reading usually stops at the end of verse 21, but we'll continue for the last couple of verses to finish out the chapter. So, let's turn to verse 20. Vayikra Hadam Shem Ishto Chawa. Here, the man, Adam, called the name of his wife Chawa. The idiom to call the name, obviously is an idiom for naming something, and the name that Adam gives to his wife is Chawa. Now, the reason for this name is explained by the next clause, the key clause introducing the explanation, Ki hi hayatha em kalchai. Because she was the mother of all living things. Probably have to put the word things in to make good English. Now, this verse, Genesis 3:20, perhaps requires a little bit of explanation, at least for English readers. The man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. What is not apparent in English translations is that this verse contains what we would regard as a pun or a paronomasia or pronomasia, if you prefer that pronunciation. This is a literary device, we commonly call it a pun, that uses a word either in more than one sense or it makes use of words that are very similar in sound, especially, in order to achieve a specific rhetorical effect. Sometimes that effect is humor. Other times that effect is to bring about some recognition of a meaning, usually by a play on the meaning of the two words involved. In this case, the words in English are Eve and living. In Hebrew, they are Chawa and Chai. Now, these words don't look at all alike in English, and they look a fair bit alike in Hebrew. It might be useful to know that in Ugaritic, this verb chaya, to live, actually occurs as chet wow yod, and so the yod that we have in chai is actually part of the original verbal idea. So there's a pun here, employing two words made from the same Hebrew root in this case, one the name and one the noun for living things. Now, the Greek translators kept this pun when they translated it. So in Greek, in the Septuagint, this comes out, the man called the name of his wife Zoe because she was the mother of all zoanton. So you can see how the pun is preserved using the Greek word for life, zoe or zoanton here, the verb, a participle from the verb. In the Latin translation, the Vulgate, Jerome did not maintain this pun. What he did was transliterate the Hebrew name and then translate the last word literally. So we end up with Heva for the name of the woman and Vivintium as the word for living. Now, how do we get Heva? Well, remember the Hebrew was Chawa, and when Jerome translates it, he uses the softer H and simply uses V instead of W. So Chawa becomes Hewa, Heva. The H drops off the end, but that's nothing. Later on, this becomes Eva, and then for us, Eve. And that's how we came about with the name Eve for the wife of Adam. In Latin, the word for live is vivo, and that's why we have the verbal form vivintium. So for reading the Hebrew text, we would know the man and his wife as Adam and Chawa. If we're reading the Greek text, we would know this as Adam and Zoe, keeping the pun. But in English, we know them as Adam and Eve. If Jerome had followed the practice of the Hebrew and the Greek, then we probably wouldn't know them as Adam and Eve. We'd probably know them as Adam and Vivian. But that's not the case. It's just a way of pointing out that sometimes the way things come about in the Bible, by the time they get to us in English translation, are just a little odd and require a little explanation. So in this case, Adam gives his wife a name that is associated with her function. That is to say, the function of being the mother of all living things. And of course, that's not true in the literal sense. She's not the mother of all living things. She's the mother of all humans. And perhaps that's what he has in mind. One other grammatical point that perhaps needs some observation here is this form, he. Now, this is what we call a forma mixta, a mixed form, a form that has elements of more than one thing. You may remember from beginning Hebrew that the masculine singular pronoun is hu, hey, wow, pointed as a shurek, aleph. The feminine pronoun is he. And so what we have here in this form is a form that preserves the wow of the masculine form, but has the vocalization of the feminine form. This is a Masoretic device, a way of telling the reader that they should read the feminine form, even though what they encounter in the consonantal text is the masculine form. Now, this is actually interesting because it's a unique thing in the Pentateuch. This form occurs not everywhere, but with considerable regularity in the Pentateuch. It doesn't occur outside the Pentateuch. So it's very unusual. This what we call a perpetual choré. It's not marked as a kethiv choré. It's just done this way all the time, and the reader should know to pronounce it as if it's the feminine form. There are a lot of theories about how this particular form came about, which we won't trouble ourselves with today, but we should at least recognize that it's a feature in the Pentateuch and here in our text in particular. So Adam named his wife Hawa because she was the mother of all chai, of all living. Or perhaps Olivia, maybe in English we would say Adam named his wife Olivia because she was the mother of all living. That would sort of preserve the pun in English. I don't know. Anyway, let's go on to verse 21. Wa'asa Yahweh Elohim la'adam ulishto. So here, waya'as, the first word, is simply the wow consecutive imperfect of asa. Remember, with third hey verbs, wow consecutive forms, the hey always drops off. So nothing unusual about this. A standard third hey, wow consecutive imperfect form. So the God Yahweh made la'adam wa la'ishto, for the man and his wife. And what did he make? Katanoth, or. Here this word katanoth from katoneth, in Hebrew katoneth is a garment or a tunic, we might say a robe. And then or is the common noun for skin or hide or sometimes leather. So he made them garments or tunics, perhaps robes of leather. And then wa yavishem, from lashav, to clothe. Here it's in the hifil, so it's transitive. Doesn't mean to put on clothes, but rather to clothe someone else. It takes an object, and here the object is in the form of the third masculine plural suffix. He clothed them. Now, our main purpose here is just to read the Hebrew text. But there is a theological question that we might want to address here. Some commentators have suggested that this is the first example of animal sacrifice, and that this act is ultimately kind of a pointer to the sacrificial death of Jesus Christ on the cross. That's not correct. There's no notion of sacrifice anywhere in this text. They would say God put the animal to death in order to make clothes for them. But that's reading something into the text that's not actually there. The text does not say that anything about God killing the animals. For all we know, the animals could have died of natural causes after the fall. So it's hazardous to read things like that into texts that are not there. In this case, we should see this probably more as an example of God showing care and concern for his creation even after they have rebelled against him. It serves as a sign that while God is rejecting them and has judged them, nevertheless, he has not forsaken them utterly. And that does lay a foundation for our understanding the trajectory that leads to the gospel in the New Testament. But this is itself not an example of animal sacrifice. Turning to verse 22. Vayomer Yahweh Elohim, so the God Yahweh said, Hem ha'adam chaya ka'echad mimindu. Here the difficulty grammatically is this first word, hain. So we'll take just a second with this. This word hain normally has two functions. The first function is to serve as an interjection, you could think of it, if you will, as a shortened form of the word hine. Behold, it's a focal element that focuses the attention of the reader on something that's about to be said. But sometimes this word is used as the way of introducing the if clause of a conditional sentence, the protasis of the conditional sentence. In this case, it functions as a parallel to the Hebrew word im, which is also the means by which a conditional sentence is introduced. So we can understand this as, behold, the man has become like one of us, or perhaps if the man has become like one of us. Before we can sort out the grammatical relationship here, we need to look at the rest of the passage, however. So, for the moment, I'm just going to translate hain as behold, because that makes it a little easier to work through things as we go forward. So, behold, the man has become like one of us. Lada'at tov wara. Here the lamed is indicating the means by which an action is performed. This usage typically goes with an infinitive construct, and that's what we have here in da'ath, the infinitive construct of yada, to know. So the man has become like one of us by knowing tov wara'ah, good and evil. And in an earlier segment, we discussed whether how we should understand that phrase. We don't need to cover all that again here. Going on. Wa'atah pid yishlach yado. Wa'atah. Now here we see something in this word atah that connects us back to the word hain that we had just a moment ago, earlier in this verse. And the thing that we said a moment ago, we will probably need to reconsider in the light of this word atah. Atah is used in a couple of ways. The first way is in the temporal sense of now, referring to a moment in time. But atah is also used in what we might describe as a logical or a rhetorical way. That is to say, it introduces a point to which the speaker has been building. Well, sometimes it's a conclusion of an argument. Sometimes it's just a point that he's been working or laboring to make. And it's this latter that we have here. So let's go ahead and read the rest of this, and we'll come back and put this together. So atah, so I'm just going to translate it now for the moment, and we'll consider how it's used in a second. Now, pen. Now, pen in Hebrew is a word used to introduce a negative result clause, or something that you don't want to happen. So commonly in English it's translated lest, but that's not the only way. You could translate so that not, that is, so that something does not happen. So I'm going to translate lest here, and again we'll come back and put this together when we get to the end. So now, lest yishlach, he stretch out here, call from shalach, to stretch out, lest he stretch out his hand, v'lakach gam me'eth hachayim, and take also from the tree of life, me'etz hachayim. So, and akal, and eat, v'chai la'olam. And now this form chai is a little unusual. It's a shortened form of the call perfect third masculine singular from chaya. So we would think the normal form would be chaya, but I suggest that you might want, in this case, to pause and say go to Bible software like Logos Bible Software and search for all the occurrences of the call perfect third masculine singular of this word chaya, and see how common this unusual shortened form actually is. I'll leave that for you for the moment. So, wa'akal wa'chai la'olam, and he eat and live la'olam. Here, olam means the noun meaning perpetuity, lamed indicating, in this case, adverbial duration. So we, in English, would probably just translate this forever, literally unto perpetuity. And perpetuity in Hebrew doesn't imply the absence of time, but rather sort of an enduring time as long as one can conceive of. So it's sort of the perpetual future. So he doesn't want him to live perpetually, put it that way in English. Now, we said we would go back and put some of this together because of the syntax of this sentence. Particularly, remember, the relationship between hein and atah later. Now, I said that atah is used in a temporal sense and in a rhetorical sense. In this case, we have the rhetorical sense here. I'm not talking about now in the sense of this moment in time, but as a result of what happened earlier. So, going back to hein, remember we said hein is used in an interjection and is the process of a conditional sentence. Now, neither of those really exactly fits here in their normal way, but what we have here is hein being used as the if clause, the protasis of a conditional sentence, except for this. In this case, it's not a condition that may or may not come about in the future. It's a condition that has already happened. And so in that sense, it's not really a conditional sentence because there's no doubt that it's going to happen. It's already happened. So what we have here is the use of hein to introduce, in effect, the situation that leads to the conclusion that the speaker draws. So in that case, we might translate this hein as something more like since or given that. So if we go back and translate something like, given that the man has become like one of us by knowing good and evil, so, and now lest introduces what we don't want to happen. In order that he does not, yishlak, extend his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live together. So this phrase highlighted in green, to stretch out his hand and take and eat and live forever. This is what we want. This is what the speaker, in this case God, wants to avoid. Because man has become like one of us, the hein introducing a condition that's already taken place. Since he has done this, then we will have to do something in order to prevent his stretching out his hand and taking and eating. That's the sense that we have in this sentence in Hebrew. It's a little unusual grammatically. We don't see this construction a lot, but it's really a variation on the idea of a conditional sentence. And what makes it unusual is simply the fact that the condition has already happened. So turning from verse 22 to verse 23, Why, Yishalchehu, and here we have a little bit of a pun. God doesn't want man to stretch out his hand. So in this case, God is going to do something using the same verb. Here, the wow introduces kind of the result of God's thinking in the previous verse. So God didn't stretch out his hand. He here the form that we have is apiel. Notice the schwa under the first root letter, the pathak. I'm sorry, the schwa under the preformative, the pathak under the first root letter, the doubled middle root letter. Here, a little more intensive idea, not to stretch out, but something like to throw out or to expel. So Yahweh, the God Yahweh, expelled him from Migan Eden, from the Garden of Eden, we usually translate. Avod et ha'adamah, in order to serve the land, the ground, the adamah. Asher lukak bisham. Here the form lukak is a pual. We don't see a lot of puals, but here we have one. From which he was taken. And we get the from which from the fact that we have a share combined with a resumptive pronoun here, with the preposition from. So literally, which he was taken from there, but in English we would say that from which he was taken. So the ground from which he, that is the man Adam, was taken. That's verse 23. And now we turn to our last verse, 24. Vayagaresh et Adam. And here the verb garash is another piel, in this case from the root garash, which means to expel or drive out. So it's essentially a synonym of what we had in the previous verse. So he drove out the man. Vayishakem bekedem lagan Eden et hakruvim. So he, shakan normally means to reside or take up residence. In this case, it's hifil, so he caused to reside there. Sometimes we would translate the hifil of this form more simply like he established, or he put, or he set up there. And another phrase, Bekedem Lagan Eden, literally from before the Garden of Eden. Sometimes the word kedem, the word for before, is used to indicate the direction of east in Hebrew, since directions are figured facing east. So what's before you is to the east. In this case, however, it may not indicate east. Some English translations, of course, translate it that way. But in this case, before simply may mean in front of. In other words, he placed it at the entrance to the Garden of Eden. So I think I would prefer to translate it that way. He established or put before, in front of the Garden of Eden, eth hakeruvim. Now here, this is the word that we usually just transliterate into English as cherubim. And perhaps it might be worth a moment to think about what a cherubim is. In the ancient world, at the time of Moses, if you use the word cherubim, Israelites would have thought in terms of something like this. This is a cherubim. It's actually a small figure carved in ivory from Arslan Tash in Syria from the 8th or 9th century, so it's a few years after Moses. But an animal, actually a lion, with a human head and with wings. These serve as protective deities or protective spiritual beings, angels, we would probably say in modern usage, protective angels in the ancient world. That's how they were understood. So, for example, here's another cherubim. This one is actually quite a large stone carving in the British Museum from Assyria, where it was stationed at the entrance to a palace, serving to guard the palace of the king. So here we've got, again, an animal, looks more like a horse in this case, with wings and with a human head. Here's probably my favorite cherubim because it kind of reminds me of the fluffy animals the fluffy little angel beings that people sometimes think of. But these are cherubim that are standing at the entrance to the temple at Dara in Syria. They are lions with wings and again with human faces. In this case, the face is turned out facing the person who's approaching. Just on the left side of this picture, you can see the edge of the steps going up into the temple. So this is right at the entrance to the temple in Dara. So cherubim here, the focus is really not on what they look like. The focus is on their function. Cherubim are beings that serve as guardian spirits. That's how they're understood in the ancient world. And so the point is they're guards, and that's the way they function here as well. God sets them up before the entrance to the Garden of Eden. And now this next to last phrase is kind of problematic. Well, ethlakat hacherev ha-mith ha-pecheth. And with, here the preposition eith, with, lakath. This is the only occurrence of this noun in Hebrew. As it is, it's a noun. It only occurs this one time, and it means something like to blaze, a blaze or a flame, a noun. We know what it means because we have the cognate verb lahat, which means to blaze up or flare up or to burn in a sense with fire. So lahat means the verb lahat to blaze up. Here, a lacheth is a blaze or a flame of fire. Now, this has to be read as a noun because it follows the preposition eith, with. And so we really kind of have to read this as a construct. And with the flame of the cherev ha-mith ha-pecheth. Here, cherev is the word for sword. Then we have a hithpael participle with a definite article from the verb hafak, which means to turn around, to spin around. And so probably put this together. And with the flame of the turning sword, in order to keep or guard the derek, the way, and here probably the way in the sense of a way in or entrance, to the Eith HaChaim, to the tree of life. So the lishmor, the word to guard here, is really connected back to Vayesh came 2 lines above as we're looking at it on the screen here. God set them up in order to guard the way to the tree of life. And the stuff in between, fills in other information. But that's why the infinitive construct lishmor is here, because it completes the thought of why Yesh came previously. So that's a quick look at reading through verses 20 to 24 of Genesis chapter 3, which brings us to the end of this chapter and this exercise in reading Biblical Hebrew.